The words that changed everything came through a crackling phone line on a Tuesday evening. Grandma Rose, I have something you need to hear. Mom and Dad don't know I recorded this, but they're planning to take your house. My 8-year-old grandson Tommy's voice trembled through the speaker, and I could hear the fear mixed with determination that only a child possesses when they know something terrible is about to happen. He didn't ask how I was feeling after my recent surgery. He didn't mention the birthday party I'd missed last month because I was too weak to drive. No, he cut straight to the heart of what mattered. They think you're getting old and confused, but I know you're not. I know what they're really doing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had been Rose Catherine Morrison for 73 years, and in all that time, I'd never imagined that my own son would see me as nothing more than an obstacle to his inheritance. But as I sat in my kitchen that evening, listening to Tommy's recorded conversation play through my old radio, I realized that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. The irony wasn't lost on me that the child in the family was the only one acting like an adult. My story begins long before that phone call, back when I was 22 and newly married to William Morrison in the small town of Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. We'd bought our house on Maple Avenue with wedding money and dreams bigger than our bank account. It was a modest 2-story colonial with yellow siding and white shutters. Nothing fancy by anyone's standards. But it had good bones and a wraparound porch where I'd planned to watch my children grow up. William worked at the steel mill and I taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary. We were ordinary people living an ordinary life, and for 27 years, that was enough. We raised our son Michael in that house, watched him take his first steps in the living room, helped him with homework at the kitchen table, and sent him off to college from the front porch. When William died of a massive heart attack at 49, that house became both my shelter and my prison. Michael had moved to Philadelphia after college, married a woman named Patricia, who worked in marketing and spoke in acronyms I didn't understand. They had Tommy when Michael was 35, and for a brief moment, I thought grandmotherhood might bridge the growing distance between us. I was wrong. Patricia saw my existence as an inconvenience, a reminder that Michael had roots in a small town she considered beneath her aspirations. The visits became less frequent after Tommy turned 3. Michael would call dutifully every few weeks, conversations that felt scripted and hollow. "How's your health, Mom? Are you taking care of yourself? You know we worry about you living alone in that big house." The concern never sounded genuine, more like someone checking items off a list. Patricia rarely spoke to me directly, preferring to communicate through Michael like I was a difficult client she'd rather avoid. Tommy was different. Even as a toddler, he had an intensity about him that reminded me of William. He would study my face when I spoke, really listen, ask questions that showed he was thinking about what I said rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. During their infrequent visits, he was the only one who seemed genuinely happy to be there. While Michael and Patricia sat stiffly on my sofa making polite conversation about the weather and the town's declining economy, Tommy would explore every corner of the house like he was discovering buried treasure. "Grandma Rose," he said during one visit when he was 6, "why does this house smell like cinnamon and old books?" I'd laughed and explained that I'd been baking cookies and reading in the same rooms for 50 years. "It smells like home," he said seriously. "Like real home, not like our apartment." Patricia had given him a sharp look then, but Tommy was already off, exploring the attic, immune to adult disapproval. That was 2 years ago. The visits stopped entirely after Patricia got promoted to regional manager, and they moved to a bigger apartment in Center City. Michael called less frequently, and when he did, the conversations grew shorter and more focused on practical concerns. "Mom, are you sure you're managing okay? That house requires a lot of maintenance. Maybe it's time to think about something smaller, more manageable." I wasn't ready to think about anything smaller. The house on Maple Avenue held 51 years of my life. William had built the kitchen cabinets with his own hands. I'd painted every room at least twice, refinished the hardwood floors when Tommy's father was learning to walk, and planted the garden that still produced tomatoes and roses every summer. Every creaky floorboard and drafty window was mine, earned through decades of mortgage payments and love. but maintaining the house was becoming harder. At 73, I couldn't climb ladders to clean gutters or shovel the entire driveway when snow fell. My knees ached in damp weather, and my arthritis made simple tasks like opening jars or changing light bulbs into daily struggles. Still, I managed. I hired neighborhood teenagers to help with yard work and found contractors for bigger repairs. The house was paid off, and my teacher's pension combined with William's modest life insurance gave me enough to live comfortably if I was careful. The health scare that changed everything happened on a Thursday morning in October. I'd been feeling dizzy for several days, dismissing it as a side effect of new blood pressure medication. When I collapsed in my kitchen while making breakfast, Mrs. Chen from next door found me unconscious an hour later when she came to borrow sugar. The paramedics said I was lucky she had a spare key. 3 days in the hospital revealed that my dizziness wasn't medication-related. A series of tests showed that I had developed atrial fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat that required immediate attention and ongoing management. The cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, was kind but direct. "Mrs. Morrison, this is manageable with proper medication and lifestyle changes, but you'll need to be more careful. No more heavy lifting, regular checkups, and someone should probably check on you daily." Michael arrived at the hospital the day before my discharge, looking harried and uncomfortable in his expensive suit. Patricia stayed in Philadelphia, citing work obligations, but she sent a fruit basket with a card signed by both of them. "Mom, you gave us quite a scare," Michael said, settling into the vinyl chair beside my bed. "The doctors say you're going to be fine, but this is a wake-up call. You can't keep living alone like nothing's changed." I studied my son's face, searching for genuine concern beneath his obvious anxiety. "I'm going to be fine, Michael. Dr. Martinez says thousands of people live normal lives with this condition. I just need to take my medication and avoid overexertion." Michael nodded, but I could see him calculating something in his head. "That's good, Mom. But what happens next time? What if Mrs. Chen hadn't found you? You could have been lying there for hours, days even." The conversation continued for an hour, Michael presenting his case like he was making a business proposal. Assisted living facilities with medical staff on site. Condos designed for seniors with emergency call systems. The benefits of living closer to family who could help with daily needs. Everything he said made logical sense, but none of it felt like love. It felt like someone trying to solve a problem as efficiently as possible. After he left, I lay in my hospital bed staring at the ceiling tiles and thinking about the difference between being cared for and being managed. Michael wanted to manage me, to find a solution that would ease his conscience and minimize his responsibility. But Tommy's reaction when I called him from the hospital was entirely different. "Grandma Rose!" His voice had.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Cracked with emotion when he heard what happened. "Are you going to be okay? I was so scared when Dad told me. I wanted to come see you, but Mom said hospitals aren't good places for kids." We talked for 20 minutes, and he asked detailed questions about my heart condition, how the medicine worked, and whether I was in pain. Before we hung up, he said something that stayed with me. "Grandma, I wish I lived closer. I would check on you every day and help you with stuff. I'm really good at opening jars now." I returned home from the hospital with a new daily routine built around medication schedules and doctor's appointments. Mrs. Chen checked on me every morning, and I hired a housekeeping service to handle the heavy cleaning. For 3 months, I managed well. My heart rhythm stabilized, and I felt stronger than I had in years. The scare had actually motivated me to eat better and take daily walks around the neighborhood. But Michael's phone calls became more frequent and more pointed. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation at the hospital. Patricia and I found some great retirement communities near us. Just to look at, no pressure." The brochures arrived a week later, glossy pamphlets featuring smiling seniors playing cards and tending small gardens. The places looked nice enough, but they weren't home. They were warehouses for old people, however nicely decorated. Spring came early that year, and with it, my annual ritual of preparing the garden. I'd been growing vegetables and flowers behind the house for 40 years, and every March I felt the same excitement about planning the coming season. This year would be different because of my heart condition, but I could still manage herbs and tomatoes, maybe some marigolds for color. I was kneeling in the dirt, planting basil seedlings, when Michael and Patricia arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning in April. They'd driven down from Philadelphia without calling, claiming they wanted to surprise me. Tommy wasn't with them, which disappointed me immediately. Patricia emerged from their BMW looking like she'd dressed for a board meeting rather than a casual visit, her heels sinking into my freshly turned soil. "Mom, what are you doing?" Michael's voice carried a sharp edge of disapproval. Dr. Martinez said no heavy lifting or strenuous activity. Gardening counts as both. I rocked back on my heels, dirt under my fingernails, and satisfaction in my chest. "I'm planting herbs, Michael. Hardly strenuous, and I feel better working in the garden than I have in months." Patricia stepped carefully around my flower beds, like they might contaminate her designer shoes. "Rose, this is exactly what we're concerned about. You're 73 years old with a serious heart condition, and you're out here alone doing manual labor. What if you'd had an episode? What if you'd fallen?" Her tone was patient in the way people use with children who aren't grasping simple concepts. We went inside for coffee, and the conversation I'd been dreading finally happened. Michael and Patricia had been researching not just retirement communities, but the practical realities of my situation. They'd spoken with real estate agents about the value of my house, calculated my monthly expenses, and even contacted my insurance company about coverage for long-term care. They presented their findings like a corporate presentation, complete with printed spreadsheets. "The house is worth about $280,000 in today's market," Michael said, sliding papers across my kitchen table. "Your monthly expenses, including utilities, maintenance, and healthcare, are running about $2,800. Your pension and Social Security cover that now, but what happens when you need more medical care? What happens when the house needs a new roof or the furnace dies?" Patricia took over seamlessly. "We found a lovely apartment community in Gladwine just 15 minutes from our place. The monthly fee covers everything: meals, housekeeping, transportation, even basic medical care. You'd have your own space, but help would always be available. And the social activities look wonderful. Book clubs, art classes, day trips to museums." I looked at their carefully prepared materials and felt something cold settle in my stomach. They'd been planning this for months, possibly since my hospital stay. This wasn't a conversation about my well-being. It was a business plan for divesting themselves of an inconvenient responsibility. "And what happens to this house?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "We'd sell it, of course," Michael said. "The equity would more than cover the entrance fee for the retirement community, plus give you a nice cushion for unexpected expenses. It's really the smartest financial decision for everyone involved." Everyone involved. I wondered if that included me or just them. The argument that followed was quiet, but intense. I explained that I wasn't ready to leave my home, that my heart condition was manageable, and that I'd built a support system in Millbrook that worked for me. Michael countered with statistics about seniors living alone, horror stories about elderly people found days after medical emergencies, and the peace of mind that professional care would provide. Patricia remained mostly silent, but her expressions made her position clear. I was being unreasonable. They stayed for dinner, continuing their campaign with a mixture of concern and pressure that left me exhausted. When they finally left that evening, Michael hugged me at the door and said, "Mom, just think about it. We're not trying to rush you, but we want what's best for you. This house is becoming a burden you don't need to carry anymore." After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by 50 years of memories and tried to understand how the home I loved had become a burden in my son's eyes. Every piece of furniture told a story: the rocking chair where I'd nursed Michael as a baby, the bookshelf William built during a weekend in 1987, the piano no one played anymore, but that had filled the house with music during Michael's teenage years. I called Tommy that night, needing to hear a voice that didn't see me as a problem to be solved. He answered on the second ring, and his excitement at hearing from me was like medicine for my bruised heart. "Grandma Rose, I was just thinking about you. I'm reading this book about gardening, and it has a whole chapter about herbs. Did you know basil can keep mosquitoes away? We talked for an hour about gardens and books and his school science project about renewable energy. He told me about a fight he'd had with his best friend Jake, and I shared advice that seemed to satisfy him. It was the most natural conversation I'd had in weeks, flowing easily between topics like conversations should. As we were saying goodbye, Tommy grew serious. "Grandma, Dad said you might move closer to us. Would you really leave your house?" The question caught me off guard with its directness. "I don't know, sweetheart. Your parents think it might be safer for me to live somewhere with more help available." There was a long pause before Tommy responded. "But that's your home. That's where all your stuff is, where you're happy. They can't just make you leave, can they?" Out of the mouths of babes. "No, Tommy, they can't make me leave. It's my house, and it's my decision." He sighed with obvious relief. "Good. Because I like visiting you there. It's the only place that feels like what homes are supposed to feel like." Over the next month, Michael called twice a week with updates on retirement communities he'd visited on my behalf. He'd toured facilities, collected brochures, and even put my name on a waiting list at his top choice. Each conversation felt like another step in a process I'd never agreed to participate in. When I tried to explain that I wasn't interested in moving, he'd launch into patient explanations about my safety and their concerns as my family. The breaking point came in late May, when Michael and Patricia arrived with Tommy for Memorial Day weekend. I was thrilled to see my grandson, who'd grown 3 inches since Christmas and lost a front tooth that gave his smile a gapped charm. He hugged me fiercely at the door and immediately wanted to see how my garden was progressing. We spent Saturday afternoon together, weeding and watering, while he told me about 2nd grade and his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who let him help care for the class hamster. That evening, after Tommy went to bed in what had been his father's childhood room, Michael and Patricia cornered me in the kitchen. Patricia was holding a folder of documents, and Michael's expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Mom, we need to talk about your future. This weekend was supposed to be relaxing, but honestly, we're more worried than ever." They'd apparently been observing me all day, cataloging signs of decline I hadn't noticed myself. How I'd held the stair railing going upstairs. How I'd asked Tommy to reach something from a high shelf. How I'd taken a brief rest while weeding, claiming it was because the afternoon was warm, rather than because I was tired. "These aren't criticisms, Mom," Michael said, his voice artificially gentle. "They're just observations. You're adapting to limitations you didn't have 5 years ago, and that's normal. But it's also concerning when you're living alone in a house that requires constant maintenance." Patricia opened her folder and spread papers across the kitchen table like she was dealing cards. "We've done more research, Rose. There's a waiting list opening next month at Sunrise Manor, the facility we think would be perfect for you. If we submit your application this week, you could move in by August. We could have the house on the market by July, and with the current real estate climate, it should sell quickly." I stared at their timeline, feeling like I was watching my life being dismantled by people who claimed to love me. "You've already contacted a real estate agent." It wasn't a question. Michael's guilty expression was answer enough. "We just wanted preliminary information, Mom, to understand our options." "Your options." The argument that followed was louder than the one in April, and I was ashamed that Tommy might hear it from upstairs. I accused them of treating me like I was already incompetent. They insisted they were protecting me from my own stubborn pride. Round and round we went, raising voices and repeating positions, until Patricia finally played what she obviously considered her winning card. "Rose, we're your family. We're the people who will have to live with the guilt if something happens to you because we didn't act on our concerns. Don't you think we deserve some consideration? Don't you think Michael deserves some peace of mind about his mother's safety?" The manipulation was expertly done, making my desire to stay in my own home into an act of selfishness against people who cared about me. I went to bed that night feeling beaten down and confused. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being stubborn and unrealistic. Maybe love sometimes looked like making hard decisions for people you care about. But lying in the bedroom I'd shared with William for 27 years, surrounded by furniture we'd chosen together and photographs of our life together, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with their approach. Sunday morning brought temporary peace. Tommy woke me up by bouncing on my bed like he was 5 years old instead of 8, demanding pancakes and stories about when his dad was little. We spent the morning cooking together, and he helped me make breakfast for his parents, who emerged looking tired and tense. The conversation at the kitchen table was stilted, everyone carefully avoiding the previous night's conflict. After breakfast, Tommy wanted to explore the attic, an adventure we'd planned during one of our phone calls. Michael and Patricia settled on the front porch with coffee and their phones, catching up on work emails that apparently couldn't wait until Tuesday. I led Tommy up the narrow stairs to the dusty space under the eaves, where 50 years of accumulated life waited in boxes and forgotten furniture. Tommy was enchanted by everything he found, William's old fishing equipment, which I'd never had the heart to donate, boxes of Michael's school papers and childhood artwork, my wedding dress in a cedar chest, yellow with age but still beautiful, photo albums chronicling decades of birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that had seemed unremarkable when they were happening. "Grandma Rose," Tommy said, holding up a picture of his father at age 10, gap-toothed and grinning beside a Christmas tree. "Dad looks just like me. Same missing tooth and everything." He studied the photograph like it contained important secrets. "He looks really happy here. Happier than he looks now." We spent 2 hours in the attic, Tommy asking questions about every discovery and listening to my stories with the focused attention that made him such a special child. When we finally climbed back downstairs, dusty and laughing, Michael and Patricia were still on the porch, but their conversation had shifted from work to logistics. I caught fragments about moving companies and estate sale services before they noticed us and changed the subject. That afternoon, while I was napping and Michael was grilling hamburgers for dinner, Tommy played in the backyard, exploring every corner with the thoroughness of a detective. He found the old tire swing William had hung for Michael 40 years ago, tested its strength, and spent an hour pushing it higher and higher. He discovered the grape arbor behind the garage where I still harvested enough fruit for jelly every September. He even found the small cemetery plot where I'd buried 3 cats over the years, each marked with a painted stone. During dinner, Tommy regaled us with his afternoon discoveries, describing the backyard like it was a vast wilderness, rather than a quarter-acre plot in small-town Pennsylvania. "There's so much cool stuff here," he said, tomato sauce on his chin and excitement in his voice. "It's like a treasure map, but real. Every place has a story." Michael smiled at his son's enthusiasm, but I saw something else in his expression. Maybe impatience, maybe calculation. "That's great, buddy," he said. "But remember, Grandma Rose might not always live here. She might move somewhere new, somewhere with more people around to help her." Tommy's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "But why would she want to move? This is her home. This is where all her stuff is. Where Grandpa used to live, where you grew up. You can't just throw that away." His 8-year-old logic cut through adult rationalizations with devastating clarity. Patricia cleared her throat carefully. "Tommy, sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions about what's safest. Grandma Rose's house is very big for one person, and if she got sick or hurt, there wouldn't be anyone nearby to help her right away." "Then we should visit more often," Tommy said immediately. "Or she could get a phone that calls for help automatically. Or Mrs. Chen could check on her more. There are lots of ways to be safe without leaving your home." He looked at me with fierce protectiveness. "Right, Grandma Rose?" "There are lots of ways." The conversation grew tense again, with Michael and Patricia trying to explain complex adult realities to a child who saw the situation in simpler terms. Tommy listened politely, but I could see him processing their arguments and finding them lacking. When they finished their explanations about safety and family obligations, he had one more question. "But what if Grandma Rose doesn't want to move? What if she wants to stay here because it makes her happy? Doesn't that matter?" The question hung in the air like a challenge none of us could answer satisfactorily. They left Monday morning after another tense breakfast, and promises to call during the week. Tommy hugged me goodbye with unusual intensity, whispering, "I don't want you to move, Grandma Rose. This house is perfect for you." His parents were already in the car, engine running, impatient to begin the drive back to their real lives. That week, Michael called 3 times to discuss next steps. He'd submitted my application to Sunrise Manor without telling me, explaining later that the waiting list moved quickly and we needed to secure a spot while we could. He'd also scheduled a consultation with an estate sale company for the following weekend, just to get an idea of what we're dealing with. Each phone call felt like another decision being made about my life without my input. I tried to push back, explaining that I hadn't agreed to any of this, but Michael had answers for every objection. The application was just paperwork. I wasn't committed to anything. The estate sale consultation was just information gathering. Nothing had to be decided immediately, but I could feel the momentum building around me, carrying me toward a future I didn't want. On Thursday evening, Tommy called just as I was finishing dinner. His voice sounded different, older somehow, and I could hear unusual background noise during our conversation. "Grandma Rose," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something important, but I can't talk long. Mom and Dad are in the living room, and they think I'm doing homework." What he told me next changed everything. That afternoon, while he was supposedly playing video games in his room, Tommy had overheard Michael and Patricia having a detailed conversation about my situation. But it wasn't the conversation I thought they were having. It wasn't about my safety or well-being at all. It was about money and convenience and getting control of my assets before I became more difficult to manage. Tommy had recorded part of their conversation on his tablet, the same device they'd given him for educational games and homework help. He'd been smart enough to start recording when he realized they were talking about me, and what he'd captured was devastating. Patricia's voice discussing how much my house would sell for, and how that money could be invested to provide better returns than my current pension and Social Security. Michael's voice acknowledging that I probably had several good years left, but agreeing that it's easier to make these transitions while she's still cooperative. Most damaging was their discussion about my medical situation. Patricia had apparently researched my heart condition and learned that many people with atrial fibrillation live normal lifespans with proper medication. But they'd been presenting my condition to retirement communities and insurance companies as more serious than it actually was, qualifying me for higher levels of care and justifying the urgency of their timeline. "They're lying about how sick you are," Tommy whispered into the phone, "and they keep talking about your money like it's already theirs. They said once you're in that place, they can manage your finances better and make sure everything's ready for when you, he couldn't finish the sentence, but I understood. They were planning for my death and treating my remaining years as an inconvenience to be managed as efficiently as possible. My house, my independence, my right to make decisions about my own life all were obstacles to their vision of a streamlined future where I was safely contained and my assets were under their control." "Tommy," I said carefully, "are you absolutely sure about what you heard? This is very serious, and I need to know exactly what they said." He assured me that he'd been listening for 20 minutes and had recorded the last 10. The conversation had been detailed and specific, leaving no room for misinterpretation. We hung up after Tommy promised to email me the recording the next day, using his school account that his parents didn't monitor. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the son I'd raised with the man who was systematically dismantling my life for financial gain. Where had I gone wrong? When had Michael stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a burden to be managed? Friday morning brought a call from Michael with news that the estate sale consultant could meet with us that afternoon instead of waiting for the weekend. "I know it's short notice, Mom, but they had a cancellation, and I'd really like to get this process started. The sooner we understand what we're dealing with, the sooner we can make informed decisions." Informed decisions. As if any decision made without my genuine consent could be considered informed. But I agreed to the meeting, partly because I was curious about their process, and partly because I was beginning to formulate a plan of my own. If they wanted to treat this like a business transaction, I needed to understand the business. The estate sale consultant was a thin woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who walked through my house like she was appraising inventory rather than examining someone's life. She took notes on everything, from my grandmother's china cabinet to William's tools in the garage, assigning estimated values with professional efficiency. Michael followed her around, asking questions about timelines and profit margins, while I trailed behind feeling like a ghost in my own home. Mrs. Fletcher was thorough and utterly without sentiment, "This mahogany dining set should bring 12 to 1500 at sale," she announced, running her hands over the table where I'd served 50 years of family meals. "The china cabinet's in excellent condition, probably 800 to 1000. These Depression glass pieces are quite collectible right now." Every assessment felt like a small death. My wedding china became nice mid-century dishware, maybe 200 for the set. The quilt my mother had made for my hope chest was handmade textile, appealing to collectors, 75 to 100. The rocking chair where I'd nursed Michael and dreamed of grandchildren became antique nursing chair, refinishing needed, $60 to $80. Michael scribbled notes as Mrs. Fletcher worked, nodding approvingly when values exceeded his expectations. I noticed he paid particular attention to items worth more than $500, asking questions about market demand and optimal timing for sale. When Mrs. Fletcher estimated the total household contents at somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000, Michael's satisfaction was obvious. "That's very helpful," he told her at the door. "We'll probably want to schedule the sale for late July or early August, once we get Mom settled in her new place. Can you hold those dates tentatively?" Mrs. Fletcher assured him that summer was an excellent time for estate sales, when families were vacationing and looking for unique pieces for vacation homes and renovated properties. After she left, Michael stayed for coffee, apparently energized by the afternoon's financial calculations. "Mom, I know that was difficult, but isn't it reassuring to know the house contents have real value? Combined with the property sale, you'll have substantial resources for whatever care you might need down the road." I studied my son's face, searching for any trace of the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. "Michael," I said carefully, "what happens if I decide I don't want to move? What if I want to stay in my home regardless of the financial considerations?" His expression shifted subtly, patience giving way to something harder. "Mom, we've been through this. You can't stay here indefinitely. Your health condition alone makes it too risky. What happens when you fall and break a hip? What happens when your memory starts to go? What happens when maintaining this place becomes impossible? What happens if none of those things happen?" I countered. "What if I live here happily for another 10 years, tending my garden and reading my books and visiting with neighbors who've known me for decades? What if the life you're so eager to change is actually the life I want to keep living?" Michael set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of someone controlling their temper. "Mom, you're being unrealistic. Nobody gets to live exactly the life they want forever. Circumstances change, health declines, and families have to make adjustments. That's just reality." "Whose reality?" I asked. "Yours or mine?" The question seemed to surprise him. For a moment he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable, like he was remembering something he'd forgotten. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the firm resolve of someone convinced of their own righteousness. "My reality is worrying about my mother every single day," he said. "My reality is lying awake wondering if you've fallen, or had another heart episode, or gotten confused and left the stove on. My reality is trying to balance my responsibility to you with my responsibility to my own family. Do you think this is easy for me?" I wanted to point out that his solution seemed designed to eliminate his worry rather than address my needs, but I held my tongue. This wasn't the time for that conversation. Not yet. Not until I had Tommy's recording and a better understanding of what I was really dealing with. Saturday morning, I received Tommy's email with an audio file attached. My hands shook as I downloaded it to my computer and put on headphones. What I heard confirmed everything Tommy had told me, and worse. Patricia's voice, clinical and calculating. "The house will probably sell for $280, maybe $300 if we're lucky. That money, properly invested, could provide $1,200 a month in income on top of her pension and Social Security." Michael's response: "That's assuming we can get her moved without too much resistance. She's getting more stubborn about the whole thing, and I'm worried she might dig in her heels if we push too hard." "Well," Patricia's voice again, "that's where the medical angle becomes important. If her doctors document concerns about independent living, we have more leverage. And once she's in assisted living, these decisions become easier to manage." The conversation continued for several more minutes, covering topics that made my stomach turn. They discussed, quote, managing her finances more efficiently, and, quote, making sure everything is properly structured for inheritance purposes. They talked about my house like it was already theirs, and my remaining years like they were an expensive inconvenience. Most chilling was their discussion about Tommy. Patricia worried that he was becoming too attached to the idea of my staying in the house, and might complicate things if he continued opposing their plans. Michael suggested they limit his visits until after I was moved, explaining that, quote, kids adapt quickly once changes are made. I listened to the recording 3 times, each playback making me angrier and more determined. This wasn't love or concern masquerading as practical planning. This was calculated manipulation designed to benefit them while appearing to benefit me. They had turned my medical condition into a weapon against my autonomy and my grandson's genuine affection into a problem to be solved. That afternoon, I called my lawyer, James Peterson, who had handled William's estate and various legal matters for our family over the years. James was only a few years younger than me, semi-retired but still sharp as a tack. I asked him to come to my house rather than meeting at his office, claiming my heart condition made driving difficult. It was a small lie that served a larger truth. James arrived Monday morning carrying his familiar leather briefcase and wearing the same serious expression he'd worn when helping me navigate William's death 24 years earlier. I served coffee in the living room and then played Tommy's recording for him, watching his eyebrows climb higher with each revelation. When it finished, he sat back in his chair and whistled softly. Rose, this is financial elder abuse. What they're describing isn't family concern. It's a systematic plan to control your assets and living situation for their benefit, not yours. He pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. The good news is that you're clearly competent to make your own decisions, and you have evidence of their true intentions. The bad news is that family disputes like this can get very ugly very quickly. I explained my situation in detail: the pressure to move, the estate sale consultation, the retirement home application I'd never agreed to, and their timeline for selling my house by summer's end. James listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and specific conversations. They haven't broken any laws yet, he said finally, but they're walking a very fine line. Submitting applications for assisted living without your consent could be considered fraud if they forged your signature. Having your house appraised without your knowledge isn't illegal, but combined with everything else, it suggests a pattern of overreach. I asked what my options were, and James outlined several approaches. I could formally revoke any powers of attorney I might have granted Michael, though I assured him I'd never signed any such documents. I could write a clear letter stating my intention to remain in my home and my refusal to consider alternative living arrangements. Most importantly, I could document everything and prepare for the possibility that Michael might seek legal guardianship if I continued to resist their plans. Guardianship? The word hit me like a physical blow. He could have me declared incompetent? It's possible, though difficult, James explained. He'd need medical testimony that you're unable to make sound decisions about your own welfare. Given your heart condition and your age, he might find doctors willing to support that position, especially if he presents their version of your living situation as dangerous or unsuitable. We spent 2 hours planning my defense. James would draft documents clearly stating my mental competency and my informed decision to remain in my home. He'd also researched the retirement community Michael had chosen, looking for any evidence of improper marketing practices or financial irregularities. Most importantly, he'd help me document everything Michael and Patricia had done to pressure me into moving. Rose, James said as he prepared to leave, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you absolutely certain you want to fight this? Your son obviously believes he's acting in your best interests, however misguided his methods might be. Family conflicts like this can cause permanent damage to relationships. I thought about Tommy's voice on the recording, fierce and protective and utterly convinced that I deserved to stay in my own home. I thought about Patricia coldly calculating the value of my possessions, and Michael discussing my remaining years like they were a business expense to be minimized. I thought about 51 years of memories embedded in every room of my house, and the garden that would bloom again next spring if I was here to tend it. James, they stopped seeing me as a person the moment they started seeing me as a problem to be solved. I'd rather fight for my right to live my own life than surrender it to people who think love means control. That week passed quietly while James prepared the legal groundwork for what we both knew was coming. Michael called twice with updates about the retirement community, mentioning that my application was moving through the system and that we should hear about available openings soon. He also informed me that he'd scheduled another consultation, this time with a moving company that specialized in senior transitions. I listened to his plans with new ears, hearing the assumption of control in every sentence. Not if you decide to move, but when you move. Not what would you like to take with you, but what makes sense to transport versus replace. Every conversation reinforced what Tommy's recording had revealed. This was a fait accompli, disguised as a collaborative process. Thursday evening brought another call from Tommy, and this time his voice carried a different kind of urgency. Grandma Rose, something's happening. Mom and Dad have been having lots of quiet conversations, and they keep stopping when I come into the room. And Dad made a phone call yesterday where he kept saying things like medical necessity and family intervention. My heart sank. James had warned me this might happen, that Michael might escalate to medical coercion if other approaches failed. Tommy, have they said anything about limiting your visits or calls to me? Not directly, but Mom mentioned that I might be too young to understand complex adult decisions, and that getting too involved in grown-up problems wasn't healthy for kids. His 8-year-old voice carried frustration beyond his years. But I'm not too young to know when something's wrong. They're not trying to help you, Grandma Rose. They're trying to control you. We talked for another 20 minutes, and I found myself marveling at Tommy's clarity about the situation. He understood instinctively what some adults never learned, that love respects choice, while control demands compliance. When we hung up, he promised to keep listening and recording if possible, though we both knew his parents were becoming more careful about their private conversations. Friday morning brought the confrontation I'd been dreading and preparing for. Michael and Patricia arrived unannounced again, but this time they weren't alone. A woman in a white coat accompanied them, introducing herself as Dr. Sarah Morgan, a geriatric specialist who Michael had asked to, quote, assess my living situation and provide professional recommendations. I invited them in, my mind racing through the legal advice James had given me about dealing with unwanted medical evaluations. Dr. Morgan was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about elderly patients. She carried a tablet and wore the kind of professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. Mrs. Morrison, she said, settling into my living room like she belonged there, your son has expressed concerns about your ability to live safely and independently. I'm here to conduct a brief assessment and provide recommendations based on current best practices for senior care. I didn't request an assessment, I replied calmly. I'm quite satisfied with my current living situation and my ongoing medical care with Dr. Martinez. Dr. Morgan's smile flickered slightly, but her professional demeanor remained intact. Of course, Mrs. Morrison, these evaluations can feel intrusive, but family members often notice changes that patients themselves might not recognize. It's quite common for seniors to underestimate risks or overestimate their capabilities as they age. The condescension was expertly delivered, wrapped in medical authority and presented as objective concern. I could see Michael and Patricia watching the interaction carefully, obviously hoping Dr. Morgan would provide the ammunition they needed to override my preferences. For the next hour, Dr. Morgan conducted what she called a, quote, comprehensive geriatric assessment. She asked questions about my daily routines, my medication management, my social connections, and my emergency plans. She tested my memory with simple exercises, evaluated my physical stability by watching me walk and climb stairs, and examined my home for safety hazards. Every aspect of my life was scrutinized through the lens of potential problems. My habit of reading late into the evening became disrupted sleep patterns that could affect cognitive function. My preference for cooking my own meals became complex daily tasks that might become overwhelming. Even my beloved garden was reframed as outdoor activities that pose fall risks for someone with your cardiac condition. I answered her questions honestly while recognizing the trap being constructed around me. Dr. Morgan was building a case for assisted living by pathologizing the normal activities of independent living. Everything I did successfully was either dangerous or unsustainable, while anything I struggled with was evidence of decline requiring professional intervention. The most disturbing part of her assessment was how she interacted with Michael and Patricia. While she maintained professional courtesy with me, her real rapport was clearly with them. She asked them detailed questions about their observations of my behavior, their concerns about my safety, and their preferences for my future care. I felt like a specimen being discussed by researchers rather than a patient being evaluated for my own benefit. When Dr. Morgan finished her assessment, she asked to speak privately with Michael and Patricia. They moved to the kitchen while I remained in the living room, straining to hear fragments of conversation. I caught phrases like cognitive decline, safety concerns, and assisted living transition, but not enough to understand her full recommendations. After 20 minutes, they returned with serious expressions and printed materials. Dr. Morgan sat across from me with her tablet and the patronizing smile I was learning to hate. Mrs. Morrison, based on my evaluation, I have some concerns about your current living situation that I'd like to discuss with you. She read from her notes in the measured tone of someone delivering a professional judgment. My heart condition was more limiting than you might realize, creating risks for emergency situations when help wouldn't be immediately available. My home was larger than appropriate for someone with mobility considerations, requiring daily navigation of stairs and outdoor areas that posed fall risks. My social isolation was concerning for someone your age, lacking the regular interaction and stimulation that prevented cognitive decline. Each concern was presented as objective medical fact rather than subjective opinion. My protests were dismissed with phrases like, "That's very common and many of my patients feel the same way initially." When I mentioned my strong relationship with Dr. Martinez and his confidence in my independent living, Dr. Morgan suggested that, quote, primary care physicians sometimes lack the specialized training to assess complex geriatric issues. Her recommendations were predictable and non-negotiable in their presentation. Immediate transition to assisted living with medical supervision, disposal of household responsibilities that created, quote, unnecessary stress, and regular monitoring by geriatric specialists who understood the quote, 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 several facilities. She had literature about several facilities, including detailed information about Sunrise Manor, that she presented like it was a prescription. "Doctor," I said when she finished her presentation, "I appreciate your professional opinion, but I disagree with your assessment. I'm managing my health condition successfully, maintaining my home adequately, and enjoying a quality of life that satisfies me completely. I have no intention of changing my living situation based on problems I don't actually have." Dr. Morgan's smile became strained. "Mrs. Morrison, denial is very common in patients facing these kinds of transitions. The changes associated with aging can be frightening, and resistance to necessary interventions is a natural psychological response. However, medical recommendations should be based on objective assessment rather than subjective comfort levels." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Dr. Morgan and my family presenting their united front while I defended my right to make my own choices. Every point I raised was countered with medical jargon and references to unspecified studies about senior safety. Every example of my successful independent living was reframed as either unsustainable or potentially dangerous. When they finally left, I felt exhausted and defeated, despite having held my ground. Dr. Morgan's assessment would become part of a medical record that could be used against me in legal proceedings. Michael and Patricia now had professional validation for their concerns, making their campaign against my independence appear more legitimate to anyone who didn't understand the biased nature of the evaluation. That evening, I called James Peterson and described the day's events in detail. His reaction was swift and angry. "Rose, this is exactly the kind of manipulative tactic we discussed." They brought in a specialist known for recommending institutional care and presented her conclusions as objective medical advice. It's a standard approach for families seeking to override an elderly person's autonomy. James explained that Dr. Morgan's assessment alone wouldn't be sufficient for a guardianship proceeding, but it could influence other medical professionals and family court judges who didn't have time to investigate the underlying bias. We needed to counter her evaluation with documentation from my regular doctors and evidence of my successful independent living. Over the weekend, I implemented the plan James and I had developed. I scheduled comprehensive evaluations with Dr. Martinez and 2 other specialists he recommended, all of whom had long relationships with me and could provide objective assessments of my capabilities. I documented my daily routines, my social activities, my household management, and my emergency preparedness plans. I also contacted Mrs. Chen and several other neighbors who could testify to my competency and independence. Most importantly, I prepared for the next phase of Michael and Patricia's campaign. James had warned me that they might attempt some form of intervention, possibly involving adult protective services or emergency medical evaluation. We developed strategies for responding to various scenarios while protecting my legal rights and documenting any coercive behavior. Monday brought the call I'd been expecting. Michael's voice was strained with artificial concern as he delivered news about my application to Sunrise Manor. "Mom, they have an opening earlier than expected. If you want the spot, you need to commit by Wednesday and move in within 2 weeks. It's a wonderful opportunity, and frankly, after Dr. Morgan's assessment, I think we should take it." I listened to his practiced presentation, hearing the pressure disguised as opportunity. The timeline was deliberately rushed, designed to prevent careful consideration or legal intervention. The framing suggested this was my last chance for a desirable placement, creating artificial urgency around a decision I'd never agreed to make. "Michael," I said calmly, "I told you I'm not interested in moving to assisted living. Nothing Dr. Morgan said changed my position. I'm happy in my home, and I intend to stay here." The silence on the other end lasted several long seconds. When Michael spoke again, his voice carried a harder edge than I'd ever heard from him. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this situation. Dr. Morgan's assessment showed significant concerns about your safety and judgment. As your family, we can't stand by and watch you put yourself at risk because you're too stubborn to accept help. What kind of help are you planning to provide whether I want it or not?" I asked, letting him hear that I understood the threat implicit in his words. Another pause then. "Whatever kind is necessary to keep you safe. We've consulted with elder care attorneys, and there are options available when family members are concerned about a senior's welfare. I hope it doesn't come to that, but your safety is more important than your preferences." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone and understanding that the gloves were finally coming off. Michael had just threatened legal action to force me from my home, and his use of phrases like elder care attorneys suggested he'd already begun the process. The battle I'd been preparing for was about to begin in earnest. That afternoon, I called Tommy's school and asked to speak with the guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson. I explained that I was Tommy's grandmother, and that there might be some family stress affecting him in the coming weeks. Without going into details, I asked her to be alert for signs that Tommy was upset or anxious about home situations he couldn't control. Mrs. Patterson was understanding and professional, assuring me that she'd keep an eye on Tommy and provide appropriate support if he seemed to be struggling. She also mentioned that Tommy was one of their most emotionally intelligent students, someone who often demonstrated wisdom beyond his years in difficult situations. Tuesday evening brought another call from Tommy, and this time his whisper was urgent with fear. "Grandma Rose, they're planning something bad." I heard Dad on the phone talking about emergency intervention and medical necessity, and Mom kept saying, "Just until the paperwork goes through," and "she'll understand eventually." My blood ran cold. Emergency intervention suggested they might be planning to have me involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation, a common tactic for families seeking to gain control over elderly relatives. Once I was in a facility, even temporarily, it would be much easier to argue that I was unable to live independently. "Tommy, this is very important," I said. "Do you know when they're planning whatever it is they're planning?" "I think soon. Dad's taking time off work, and Mom canceled her business trip for next week. And they keep talking about getting it done before she has time to complicate things." "Grandma Rose, I'm really scared. What they're talking about sounds mean. We talked for a few more minutes, with me trying to reassure Tommy while gathering as much information as possible. When we hung up, I immediately called James Peterson at home, despite the late hour. What I told him prompted an emergency meeting for the next morning. James arrived Wednesday with reinforcements, a colleague who specialized in elder law, and another who had experience with involuntary psychiatric commitments. They spread legal documents across my dining room table and outlined the battle plan we'd need if Michael proceeded with his threats. Rose, James said seriously, if they're planning emergency intervention, we need to be ready with immediate legal response. I'm going to file preemptive paperwork, establishing your competency, and your explicit refusal of any medical or psychiatric evaluation you haven't personally requested. We're also going to document this conversation so there's a clear record of your mental state and decision-making capacity. The elder law specialist, Maria Santos, explained the tactics commonly used in cases like mine. Families would call Adult Protective Services with reports of self-neglect or cognitive decline, prompting investigations that could lead to emergency placement. They might arrange for police welfare checks that could escalate into involuntary medical evaluation if the officers were convinced the person was confused or unsafe. The key is documentation, Maria explained. We need clear evidence that you're competent, prepared, and making informed decisions about your own welfare. Any sign of confusion or unpreparedness could be used against you. We spent the morning creating an extensive paper trail, statements from my doctors confirming my mental and physical competency, letters from neighbors and friends describing my active and independent lifestyle, financial records showing that I was managing my affairs responsibly, emergency contact information and care plans that demonstrated I wasn't isolated or unprepared for health crises. Most importantly, we prepared legal documents that would prevent Michael from making medical or financial decisions on my behalf without my explicit consent. If he was planning to claim emergency authority over my welfare, these papers would make that much more difficult. Thursday passed quietly, but I felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Michael didn't call, which was unusual given his recent pattern of frequent contact. When I tried calling him, the phone went straight to voicemail. Patricia's phone did the same. Even trying to reach Tommy resulted in a message that their home phone had been temporarily disconnected. The silence was more ominous than any argument we'd had. It suggested they were implementing whatever plan they'd developed, cutting off communication to prevent me from interfering or seeking help. I spent the day double-checking my legal preparations and making sure Mrs. Chen and my other neighbors were aware that I might need their assistance in the coming days. Friday morning at 8:30, 3 vehicles pulled into my driveway simultaneously. Michael and Patricia climbed out of their BMW, but they were accompanied by 2 official-looking cars containing people I didn't recognize. My heart hammered as I watched the group assemble on my front porch, clearly preparing for some kind of coordinated approach. The doorbell rang with the authority of people who expected to be admitted immediately. When I opened it, Michael stood flanked by a woman in a business suit carrying a clipboard and a man who introduced himself as Officer Daniels from the County Sheriff's Department. Behind them, Patricia held Tommy's hand while he stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Mom," Michael said, his voice carrying artificial calm, "these people are here to help us resolve the situation we've been discussing. This is Ms. Rodriguez from Adult Protective Services, and Officer Daniels is here to ensure everyone's safety while we conduct a welfare assessment." Ms. Rodriguez stepped forward with practiced authority. "Mrs. Morrison, we've received reports of potential self-neglect and unsafe living conditions. I'm required to conduct an immediate assessment of your welfare and your ability to maintain adequate self-care in this environment." I looked past them to Tommy, who was pulling against Patricia's grip and trying to move toward me. His face was streaked with tears, and I could see him mouthing the words "I'm sorry" over and over. Whatever they'd told him about their purpose here, he clearly understood that this was the bad thing he'd been worried about. "Officer Daniels," I said, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart, "am I under arrest or suspected of any crime?" "No, ma'am," he replied, looking uncomfortable with his role in the situation. "I'm just here to maintain order while these folks do their assessment. Family welfare checks can sometimes get emotional." Ms. Rodriguez was already pushing past me into my house, clipboard in hand and eyes scanning for evidence of the problems that had been reported to her agency. Michael and Patricia followed, with Patricia maintaining her grip on Tommy's hand, despite his obvious distress. I found myself being herded into my own living room, while strangers took inventory of my private life. Mrs. Morrison. Ms. Rodriguez announced, settling into my favorite chair and opening her folder. I need to ask you some questions about your daily routines, your medical care, and your safety practices. I also need to examine your living environment for any conditions that might pose risks to your well-being. What followed was the most humiliating hour of my adult life. Ms. Rodriguez questioned every aspect of my independence with the assumption that I was probably incapable of caring for myself properly. She examined my refrigerator for expired food, my medicine cabinet for properly managed prescriptions, my stairs for safety rails, and my bathroom for grab bars and non-slip surfaces. Every normal aspect of living alone was reframed as a potential hazard. The stack of books beside my reading chair became a trip hazard. My preference for keeping the thermostat at 68 degrees became inadequate climate control. Even my well-tended garden was classified as outdoor maintenance beyond appropriate capacity for someone with cardiac limitations. Michael and Patricia provided helpful commentary throughout the assessment, pointing out concerns they'd observed during recent visits. Michael mentioned my increasing fatigue and confusion about financial matters. Patricia described my resistance to reasonable safety suggestions and, quote, unrealistic assessment of my own capabilities. Through it all, Tommy stood silently beside Patricia, tears streaming down his face as he watched strangers dissect my life. When Ms. Rodriguez asked if he had any concerns about his grandmother's welfare, he shook his head emphatically and said, "Grandma Rose takes perfect care of herself. She doesn't need help from anyone who doesn't want to give it." Patricia squeezed his hand sharply and apologized for his inappropriate outburst, explaining that children sometimes didn't understand complex adult situations. But Tommy had understood perfectly, and his simple statement cut through all the professional jargon and manufactured concern to the heart of the matter. After examining every room in my house and documenting various deficiencies on her forms, Ms. Rodriguez announced her preliminary conclusions. Based on the reported concerns and her own observations, she was recommending immediate placement in a supervised care environment while a full investigation was conducted. The placement would be temporary, she assured me, just until my family could arrange appropriate long-term support services. Ms. Rodriguez, I said, standing up from my own sofa with all the dignity I could muster, I need you to understand something very clearly. I did not request this assessment, I do not agree with your conclusions, and I absolutely refuse any placement outside my own home. I have legal representation, medical documentation of my competency, and a support system that meets all my needs. I walked to the dining room and returned with the folder James had prepared, containing all the legal documents and medical evaluations we'd assembled. Ms. Rodriguez examined them with obvious annoyance, realizing that this wasn't going to be as simple as she'd expected. Mrs. Morrison, these documents are interesting, but they don't address the immediate safety concerns that brought us here today. Your family has provided specific examples of declining judgment and self-care that need to be addressed regardless of what your personal physician might have documented last month. The standoff continued for another 30 minutes, with Ms. Rodriguez insisting on the authority of her assessment while I stood firm on my legal rights and documented competency. Officer Daniels looked increasingly uncomfortable with his role, especially as it became clear that this was a family dispute rather than a genuine emergency. Finally, Michael played what he obviously considered his trump card. Mom, we didn't want it to come to this, but if you continue to refuse reasonable assistance, we're prepared to petition for emergency guardianship based on Dr. Morgan's assessment and today's findings. We've consulted with attorneys who specialize in these situations. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything I'd worked to build and preserve, but I had one advantage they didn't know about: Tommy's recording and my own preparation for exactly this moment. Michael, I said, looking directly into his eyes, before you make any legal filings, there's something you need to hear. I walked to my stereo system and inserted the CD that James had helped me prepare, containing Tommy's original recording plus several additional conversations I'd captured over recent weeks. As the first words began to play, Michael's face went white with recognition of his own voice discussing my house's market value and their timeline for gaining control of my assets. The room fell silent except for the damning audio evidence of their real motivations. Patricia's voice, cold and calculating, discussing the best way to manipulate my medical situation. Michael's voice acknowledging that I probably had years of healthy life ahead of me, but agreeing that it was easier to manage these transitions while she's still cooperative. Ms. Rodriguez listened with growing understanding, her professional expression shifting from authority to embarrassment, as she realized she'd been manipulated into participating in financial elder abuse disguised as family concern. Officer Daniels stepped back from the group, his hand moving unconsciously toward his radio as he began to understand the true nature of what he was witnessing. When the recording finished, the silence stretched, until Tommy broke free from Patricia's loosened grip and ran to me, throwing his arms around my waist and burying his face against my side. "Grandma Rose?" he sobbed. "I tried to warn you. I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen to me." I held my grandson close and looked at the adults who had spent months manipulating both of us for their own financial benefit. "Ms. Rodriguez," I said calmly, "I believe you've heard enough to understand that the concerns reported to your agency were fabricated to serve my son's financial interests, rather than my welfare. I trust you'll be documenting this in your report." Ms. Rodriguez was already packing up her materials, clearly eager to distance herself from a situation that had become legally and ethically compromised. "Mrs. Morrison, based on what I've observed and heard here today, I see no evidence of self-neglect or unsafe living conditions. I'll be closing this case with a recommendation that no further intervention is necessary." Officer Daniels approached Michael and Patricia with a new level of professional seriousness. "Folks, what I heard on that recording suggests potential criminal activity. Elder abuse is a felony in this state, and using false reports to manipulate government services is also against the law. I'm going to need to see some identification and get statements from both of you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.